A rigorous analysis must include counterpoints, not to dismiss any position, but to understand the full spectrum of valid perspectives. Proponents of universal policies argue they avoid stigma and provide a broad base of support, but critics point out that means-targeted approaches, such as scaled funding based on family income, might be more effective at reducing economic inequality. The debate echoes long-standing policy disagreements about the role of universal versus targeted social investment. Investing in public markets can yield high returns over long periods, but it also introduces volatility risk. For beneficiaries who lack safety nets, a period of market downturn could diminish the real value of their accounts. Some economists suggest hybrid models that guarantee a minimum floor alongside market participation. The EU-India Pact raises debates about labor market effects. Supporters argue that talent mobility enhances innovation and fills critical shortages. Opponents worry about downward wage pressure or displacement of domestic workers. These are contested issues requiring careful empirical study rather than polarized rhetoric. As 2026 unfolds, Trump accounts stand as one of the most ambitious experiments in federal economic policy in recent American history, reflecting both generational aspirations and political calculation. Whether they will deliver on their promise of broad economic empowerment is not yet known. It will take years of data and outcomes to assess impact. Across the Atlantic, Europe's mobility strategy with India highlights a contrasting priority: harnessing global human capital to sustain economic growth amid demographic decline. Both approaches grapple with the central challenge of our era: how to create opportunity in a world marked by rapid technological change, population shifts, and intense geopolitical competition. For citizens, policymakers, and global observers, the task is not simply to judge policies based on slogans or partisan framing, but to scrutinize their design, incentives, and outcomes. As these debates play out in legislatures, boardrooms, and living rooms, the contours of the 21st century political economy will continue to be defined. The immediate domestic consequence of Trump accounts is that millions of young Americans now hold investment accounts with federal seed funding. Whether this translates into higher educational attainment, increased home ownership, or entrepreneurial activity remains to be empirically seen over years and decades. However, the policy already shapes political discourse. It has become a talking point in election cycles, especially among Republican strategists who frame it as evidence that their party is offering positive, forward-looking economic solutions. Public opinion research suggests mixed reactions. Supporters praise the idea of universal investment in youth, while critics view it as insufficiently targeted or worry it diverts attention from other pressing social needs like healthcare, childcare, and direct income support. Financially, the policy will require ongoing federal budget commitments and regulatory oversight. The government's role as a seed contributor and regulator of these accounts positions it at the intersection of public policy and private market participation, a dynamic that may influence future debates on financial regulation, retirement policy, and economic equity. The U.S. focus on domestic investment contrasts with the EU's outward-looking labor mobility strategy. The EU-India Mobility Pact may influence global migration patterns, especially among young professionals seeking opportunities abroad. It may also strengthen economic ties between Europe and India, potentially shifting trade, investment, and diplomatic alignments. For India, the pact reinforces its position as a source of global human capital and deepens economic integration with advanced economies. This may have long-term implications for India's own development trajectory and its role in global innovation networks.
For the United States, these developments abroad underscore competitive pressures. While the U.S. pursues domestic wealth creation mechanisms like Trump accounts, other advanced economies are focusing on talent attraction and demographic strategies. How these differing approaches affect their respective economic performance, innovation capacities, and geopolitical influence remains an open question.
To grasp why these policies are politically salient, we must delve into the motivations and constraints shaping the actors involved. At its core, the Trump Accounts initiative is motivated by two political and economic logics. Expanding asset ownership. Policymakers backing the program argue that expanding asset ownership, particularly among younger Americans, can strengthen both individual economic prospects and broad participation in market growth. The rhetoric of "every American has a stake in the country's success" resonates in political messaging that emphasizes ownership, investment, and self-sufficiency. Addressing economic anxiety. For many Americans, especially younger generations, home ownership, higher education affordability, and stable employment have become more elusive compared with previous decades. Politicians from both parties have sought policies that respond to this sense of economic uncertainty. Trump accounts are pitched as a pro-growth remedy aimed at long-term empowerment rather than short-term relief. However, important constraints temper this political agenda. One is distributional fairness. By design, universal policies risk concentrating benefits among those already advantaged, unless accompanied by redistributive mechanisms. Opponents argue that a means-tested or progressive structure, where lower-income families receive enhanced funding, would be more equitable. A second constraint is market volatility. Because Trump accounts invest in stock market indexes, their ultimate value depends on market performance over 18+ years. While historical data indicate long-term market growth, there are periods of stagnation and decline. Critics argue that government-backed investment vehicles should minimize risk exposure for beneficiaries who may not have financial safety nets if markets underperform. Finally, there is a political framing constraint. The very name, Trump accounts, makes the policy a partisan symbol. Polling indicates that such branding can boost support among core Republican voters but dampen enthusiasm among independents or Democrats, which complicates the narrative that the policy is a neutral, broadly appealing economic tool. For the European Union, labor policy is deeply intertwined with demographic and economic imperatives. Motivations include demographic realities, with median ages rising and birth rates below replacement in most EU states. Labor force growth depends increasingly on immigration and cross-border mobility. The Mobility Pact with India attempts to systematize these flows in a way that aligns with market needs. Global competition for talent. In a world where knowledge economies dominate, access to skilled workers is a competitive advantage. The EU's pact with India positions the EU to draw from a pool of educated, bilingual, and mobile professionals. Strategic partnerships. Strengthening ties with India is seen by many EU policymakers as a way to balance economic and geopolitical relations with China and other global powers. Yet constraints are equally significant. Domestic political resistance. Immigration remains a politically sensitive issue in many EU states. Parties of the center and left may support talent mobility, but right-leaning parties often campaign against perceived labor competition or cultural change. Labor market regulation. Europe has more rigid labor protections compared with other regions. Integrating external workers into these systems requires careful regulatory alignment, a complex administrative task. Public opinion.
while Europeans' attitudes towards immigration and labor are varied. While some countries welcome external talent as an economic necessity, others perceive it as a threat to wage levels or social cohesion. To understand these developments, we need to situate them within broader historical and institutional contexts. The idea that government should play a role in ensuring broad access to capital is not new in American history. In the 1930s, the Social Security Act established a lifelong safety net for retirees and the unemployed. In the 1970s and 1980s, individual retirement accounts, IRAs, emerged as vehicles for personal savings with tax incentives. More recently, baby bonds proposals, publicly funded trust accounts for children, have been discussed by progressive policymakers as tools for reducing racial and economic wealth gaps. Trump accounts borrow elements from these traditions, but with a distinct political and financial design. By making the seed investment universal rather than targeted to low-income families, the policy aligns with a broad, non-means-tested approach. This reflects a long Republican philosophical preference for universal benefits over means-tested programs, under the reasoning that near-universal participation avoids stigmatization and broadens political support. Yet this universality is precisely what some critics find problematic. Economists concerned with inequality, including those who study wealth distribution and intergenerational mobility, often stress that universal programs can inadvertently widen relative gaps because higher-income families have greater ability to add supplemental contributions. For example, a family already accustomed to investing may put additional funds into a Trump account every year, compounding investment gains over time, while families with limited resources may not. Without safeguards or targeted support, the end result can be that wealthy families gain disproportionately. Institutionally, Trump accounts are administered through federal financial regulations that increasingly emphasize private market participation rather than direct government control. This reflects decades of bipartisan belief in markets as wealth generators, but it also raises regulatory questions about risk exposure for minors and the role of federal oversight in investment strategies. Meanwhile, Europe faces its own set of structural pressures. Unlike the United States, many EU member states have aging populations and low birth rates. Labor force participation is declining in some regions, and in others there are persistent skills shortages in sectors such as information technology, healthcare, and scientific research. Historically, European countries have adopted a range of approaches to labor mobility. Within the EU itself, the Schengen zone and internal labor frameworks allow relatively free movement across member states. Outside the EU, movement is more restricted and typically requires country-specific visas. The EU-India Mobility Agreement represents a concerted effort to harmonize and streamline pathways for external talent, reflecting a recognition that competitive economies need flexible labor strategies. India, for its part, supplies one of the largest pools of skilled labor in the world, particularly in areas like engineering, software development, and scientific research. The demographic profile of India is younger than most of European countries, which makes it a natural partner in any strategy aimed at sustaining labor forces well into the mid-21st century.
To understand the heart of the political narrative in the United States, we start with Trump accounts. In late 2025, U.S. political leaders and Treasury officials unveiled a new initiative that would automatically establish an investment account for every American child born between 2025 and 2028. Each of these accounts would receive an initial $1,000 contribution from the federal government. These accounts, structured much like an individual retirement account (IRA) invested in broad market index funds, are meant to grow over decades and be accessible to the beneficiary at age 18. Proponents, including senior Republican lawmakers and economic advisors, have framed the policy in aspirational terms.
They argue it provides early lifetime capital, particularly for families who may otherwise lack access to investment opportunities. Some estimates suggest that a child born today could see tens of thousands of dollars in accumulated value by early adulthood. These projections, typically based on long-term market returns, are a central part of the policy's public appeal. Support has also come from unexpected quarters of the private sector. Several large financial institutions, including major U.S. banks, pledged matching contributions for eligible families or employees. Philanthropic commitments have been announced, with pledgers hoping to contribute on behalf of children in underserved communities. In political speeches and media appearances, Republican senators and commentators have touted the accounts as emblematic of a new economic paradigm focused on ownership, participation, and intergenerational opportunity. At the same time this debate unfolds in the United States, in Brussels, policymakers finalized a different type of economic initiative, one focused not on investment accounts, but on mobility and labor forces. In early 2026, the European Union and the Republic of India announced a mobility agreement aimed at facilitating the movement of students, researchers, seasonal workers, and highly skilled professionals between India and EU member states. The centerpiece of this agreement is a legal gateway office in India, designed as a one-stop hub for visas and related services, attempting to streamline bureaucratic hurdles and align talent flow with labor market needs across Europe. Supporters of the pact argue it is a win-win, addressing labor shortages in aging European societies while providing greater opportunities for Indian professionals and students in dynamic European economies. Some European officials see it as part of a broader strategy to strengthen ties with India, balance global geopolitical shifts, and enhance competitiveness in a world of tightening labor markets. Critics, however, raise questions about wage pressure, integration, and domestic political fallout. Immigration and labor policy remain contentious across many EU member states, and any shift in mobility patterns evokes robust debate about labor market protection, cultural integration, and social cohesion. The juxtaposition of these policies, one in the US and one in Europe, frames a larger story about how advanced economies grapple with economic insecurity, demographic change, technological disruption, and global competition.
In the winter of 2026, two very different policy stories have captured political attention on opposite sides of the world, one in the United States and another in Europe. In Washington, D.C., the new federal policy known informally as Trump accounts has become a centerpiece of economic messaging by Republican leaders. Launched under the sweeping One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed by Congress in 2025, Trump accounts are designed to give every child born in the United States between 2025 and 2028 a $1,000 seed investment in a tax-advantaged investment vehicle. The idea, proponents say, is to give the next generation a financial head start, a stake in the long-term growth of the U.S. economy, in the form of a diversified investment account they can access as adults. Hundreds of thousands of accounts have already been opened, and major corporations, including some of the largest U.S. banks, have pledged to match contributions for their employees. To supporters, this policy represents a reimagining of American opportunity, a proactive step toward restoring what many have long described as the American dream. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the European Union has taken steps that may reshape labor mobility and economic strategy on a continental scale. In early 2026, the EU and India signed a comprehensive mobility agreement, including the creation of a legal gateway office to streamline the entry of students, researchers, and skilled professionals into Europe. Advocates frame the pact as vital to addressing demographic decline and skills shortages across the bloc. Critics, however, argue it raises complex questions about labor markets, integration, and social cohesion. These two developments, one domestic and one international, may seem disconnected at first glance, but together they highlight a broader political contest over how advanced economies respond to economic inequality, demographic change, and global competition in the 21st century. This documentary explores these interlocking themes from multiple angles: policy design, political debate, economic impact, domestic implications, and geopolitical context. We investigate what Trump accounts are, why they matter, who supports them, who opposes them, and how they fit into larger debates about economic opportunity. We also examine the EU-India Mobility Pact as an example of how other major economies are approaching workforce strategy and global engagement.